Thank you, Professor Heather. It's a privilege to have you chair this session. And it is particularly because of your interest in state and the kind of historiography around the state that we thought that you would be ideal to chair this session. Um, Thank you all for being here. Last night we had a very long session. We ended at 9 p.m. Many of you were there. Thank you for coming back this morning and being with us at this workshop. Um, well, to be frank, I had a different theme that I was to speak on today. But because another speaker who had been invited wished to speak on that theme, uh, at almost the very last minute, maybe about 4 or 5 days ago, I had to shift. So, in a sense, I'm not really going to be speaking about something that is very new, something that really covers fresh ground as far as any research inputs are concerned. What I would like to do is present some of the work that's been done on the issue of ideology, political ideology in particular, and the state, and also look at the historiographical debates around that. So it is within that that I position my discussion today on the copper plates of the Cōlas. Now, as many of you would know, and especially those of you who are doing the course on the Chola state, but possibly also other courses in the Center for Historical Studies, one of the most significant historical debates or historiographical debates is about the ideological underpinnings of the state. And scholars who had focused on dynastic history in the early 20th century discussed the ruler's munificence, particularly his patronage of religions and the arts, with no specific or broad connotation of political ideology. If at all ideology came in, it was only in this tangential manner in the discussion that it appeared. It was assumed in such studies that the state as an entity existed from the early historic period, and notwithstanding the chronological lags in different parts of the subcontinent, there was merely a shift from one dynasty to another. The remarkable and painstaking scholarship of R.G. Bhandarkar, H.C. Rai Chaudhary, Nilakanta Shastri, and other stalwarts laid the foundation for a better understanding of early India, especially because of their relentless search for sources and their plumbing of these for historical details. The shift from dynastic to political history, in the sense of examining institutions and structures, primarily gained hold from the 1950s. And here, as far as the study of the early Indian state is concerned, the names of D.D. Kosambi, R.S. Sharma, Noboru Karashima are very familiar to all of you. They completely transformed our understanding of the history of the subcontinent, and especially the basis for periodization. So rather than see dynastic shifts as the basis for periodization, and then looking at the kind of colonial periodization that you had as Hindu, Muslim, and British, and so on, to go beyond that, to look outside of that, and to look at socioeconomic changes and transformations, and on the basis of that, to talk about periodization. Almost at the same time that these scholars were coming up with their understanding, there was this major anthropological turn in historical studies, particularly in Western Indological departments. And there developed a historiography that sought to study the ideological basis of the state. And this is not merely in the case of South Asia or India, but also in the case of Southeast Asia. And many of these works, especially on India, argued that the pre-modern Indian state had little or no political economic substance. It was particularly the Chola state that caught the attention of one of the votaries of this position. And you are all familiar with this scholar, Burton Stein, who in his work outlined the segmentary state thesis, peasant state and society in South India. Here the emphasis was placed on ritual sovereignty. That is, that the state had no real control, except in small pockets that constituted its core. but it was able to exert itself beyond the core of its dominion because of its exertion of ideological control. That issue of legitimacy that our chair, Professor Najaf Haider, just flagged, is something that was seen at the core, at the center of this political expression of the state. And how was this ideological control maintained? It was through the expression of certain kinds of religious ideas, the patronage of religious institutions, certain kinds of ritual practices, and so on. Now, copper plates and stone inscriptions numbering over 60,000 in addition to literary works, and here I draw upon the work of Karashima, Professor Noboru Karashima, as well as that of Professor Subbarailu, who have estimated the numbers broadly, and or who have presented the estimates that have been drawn up by other scholars, where you have a fair number of Tamil inscriptions across India numbering about 60,000, and within that a fairly large number in Tamil, and of course in other languages as well, as you can see from this particular pie chart. Now, as far as Tamil inscriptions are concerned, Professor Subbarailu has broken these down into broad periods, and you can see that the bulk of the inscriptions that we have are actually produced in this early medieval period from 900 to 1300 CE. So this is the time period when you have the most number of inscriptions that were issued. Now, most of these inscriptions are stone records, culvetters, and they are issued primarily by the Cōlas. It is estimated that at least 3/4 of these are issued by the Cōlas. And on the other hand, when we look at the number of copper plates that are issued by this dynasty, we find that it's a very, very paltry number that we come across. Now, as far as the copper plates are concerned, we have several that have been discussed by various scholars. The earliest of these belong to the reign of Parantaka Chola, who ruled from 907 to 955, and Nagaswami, who has edited and translated the Velanjari copper plates issued in the year 932 CE, argues that it is actually the second Shasana to be issued by this ruler, the first being the Udendram plates, generally ascribed to Prithvipati II. Now, Prithvipati II was a Ganga, local lineage chief, if you like, who was incorporated into the Chola state system, and who fought many wars on behalf of the Cholas. And Nagaswami argues that actually he was the Vigyapti of that particular record. That is, he was the one who requested for the particular grant to be made, rather than actually the grant itself being issued by him. At any rate, this is certainly accepted that Parantaka is the one who first issues the copper plates. Of course, this is a fluid situation. We are finding copper plates, we are finding inscriptions, over the years, and even recently in 2010 there was the Tiruvindalur copper plate that was discovered. But not going into that, the major works that have been, the major copper plates that have been discussed are the Anbil plates of Sundara Chola dated to 961 CE, the Madras Museum plates of Uttama Chola dated to 976 CE, the Karandai plates dated to 1020, larger Leiden plates where the grant itself is issued in the time of Rajaraja Chola in 1005, but it is issued actually or inscribed in the time of Rajendra Chola, and it is undated. Then you have the Tiruvalangadu plates, which have two dates, 1018 and 1028. We have the Ishalam copper plates, which is of 1037. All of these belong to the reign of Rajendra Chola. Then we have that particular copper plate that I mentioned, Tiruvindalur copper plate, which is considered the biggest copper plate discovered in India. And it has been discussed by Professor Subbarayulu and Dr. Maksha Gandhi. We have this issued in the year 1053. 1054, there is an addition to the grant that is being made, and finally in 1065. So it's got a broad time period. And then we have the Charala plates of Veera Rajendra in 1069. Here we have a copy of the Prashasti in the Kanyakumari inscription of Veera Rajendra, and then we have the smaller laden plates of Kulotugga I, issued in 1090. So really a very, very rich corpus, even though it's very few when we actually compare it with the number of stone inscriptions as well as the kinds of copper plates that are issued by other dynasties. However, even if they are small in number, they are very rich as sources, and that is why I will be looking at these. Now, for examining political economic issues and social hierarchies and institutions as they developed in the early medieval period in the Tamil region, these have been used extensively. Since we are recording and since we have an online audience, should I wait? Make other arrangements. Coming back to the paper, so I was really covering ground on the kind of historiographical issues involved in looking at the state and looking at ideology and the state, and how inscriptions and copper plates have been very important in examining this issue. And while they have been used to talk about political economic structures, social hierarchies and institutions and so on, one of the significant aspects of the records, namely the ideological transactions that actually take place, that is something that has received some attention, but the focus has been on the ideological aspect alone. And that is what I wish to engage with over here. So scholars have tried to look particularly at the royal eulogies and the way in which in these copper plates and inscriptions you have so much of a discussion on the king, the ruler, and using various kinds of descriptions, analogies, and ways of representation. We find that the persona of the king is presented in these public documents. Essentially, the copper plates and inscriptions are public documents, and it is in that respect that this is a very important aspect. The Sanskrit term Prashasti itself. Now, if we were to go into a discussion of this, as Sheldon Pollock has done, it is to denote such an ideological transaction. And it first makes its appearance in Prakrit records of the Shatavahanas in the Deccan. Although, we do have the records of Ashoka, they do not have the Prashasti. So what we have is in the Shatavahana records primarily that kind of an ideological transaction. Why is this important? Because generally it is argued that the Prashasti is something that emerges with the use of Sanskrit, and Pollock himself then talks about how this is not the case. You do have Prakrit that is being used, but it is with the Gadya Kavya, Prashasti of Rudradaman, the Western Kshatrap ruler around 150 CE, that we find its first appearance in Sanskrit. Now, Sheldon Pollock argues that essentially the Prashasti was the public presentation of political will. Political will was being presented before a larger public. That larger public could be the court, it could be a galaxy of kings, it could be the general population also over which the king ruled. Treatises on dramaturgy like the Natya Shastra, generally dated around the 2nd century AD, talk of the propitiation of a king. There is a prescription of the propitiation of a king and a region in drama. And this is what it terms as Prashasti. In the 9th century, a text on poetics, Rudrata's Kavya Alankara, this is dated to around 850 CE, terms Prashasti as descriptive with connections in description. Genealogy was emphasized as a part of it. Vishwanatha, in the 14th century, patronized by the Eastern Ganga kings, in his Sahitya Darpana, in his Virudamani Mala, in his Prashasti Mala, he talks specifically on Prashasti and how the Prashasti is to be written. What is it supposed to convey? The form, the content, these are issues then that he discusses in detail. Now, clearly what we can see is over the first millennium and by the middle of the second millennium CE, the Prashasti as a form of political presentation of the king is very, very firmly established. And it is particularly in the early medieval period that we find that it is fully evolved as a mode of communication. Now, when you look at the terms that are used as synonyms for Prashasti, for instance, Viruda, this is derived from the Tamil Virudu or from the Kannada and Telugu Birudu and means banner or insignia or a mark or a title. So clearly a term that was used to denote eulogy, whether it is Prashasti, whether it is Viruda, these gained greater conceptual clarity and disambiguation at the hands of literateurs over the first millennium CE. So the conceptual depth and significance of the Prashasti itself evolved over the first millennium. Now, Pollock locates the commencement of what he defines as, in quotes, the cosmopolitan era in the literary cultural domain in the development of a genre of literature which is kavya, meaning that which is written, and sees the Prashasti or inscriptional royal panegyric as accompanying this development and intrinsic also to this development. So the two have to be seen together, primarily the development of kavya and secondarily the Prashasti itself as it evolves, but the two are very closely interlinked. Now, Richard Solomon refers to the copper plates, the Tamra Shasanas, the Tamra Pattas, the Tamra Palis, the Dana Shasanas, etc. in texts like the Vishnu and the Yagyavalkya Smriti. We are not going to be able to show you the PowerPoint. I apologize for that. But there is really very little that is there in the PowerPoint. It is more to flag certain certain aspects that I have put in some details, and I can very well talk about it in my presentation. Now, I was talking about the importance of the Prashasti, the manner in which Sheldon Pollock talks of the Prashasti, how as a genre it develops over the first millennium CE, and you have in fact treatises that are actually written around what is the Prashasti, how should it be written, and so on. Although at the time when Prashastis are actually being written and developed, particularly in the early medieval period, it doesn't really appear like they are following any set blueprint. But there is a certain world that is represented in the Prashasti. There are certain ideas that are represented in the Prashasti, and this is what then lends meaning to the Prashastis that we find, even though they come from different regional contexts. Even then we actually do find that there are connections because of the kind of ideas, of symbols, the mythic allusions that are there in them, and so on. So it's in that sense that we actually see the Prashasti itself as a genre that has emerged in the first millennium CE. This is something that he talks about in great detail, Pollock, in his work, The Language of the Gods in the World of Men. Coming to the discussion of the inscriptions themselves and how do we look at the inscriptions, Richard Solomon talks of the Tamra Shasana, the Tamrapatta, the Tamrafali, the Dana Shasana. These are different terms that are used in the Smritis, and he classifies these as generally having the following sections: a preamble, in which you have an invocation, a place of issue, a grantor's name and genealogy, and the people that it is addressed to. Then we have a notification, a gift specification, that is, to whom is the gift being made, when is it being made, is there a particular date, for what purpose is it being made. And then, of course, we have the concluding section where there's an exhortation, generally in the form of an imprecation, punishments, etc. If the grant is violated or transgressed. You have officials who are mentioned. You also have dates that are mentioned over here. Now, in the Tamil region, the copper plates appear first during the time of the Pallavas. And these copper plate charters are in Prakrit. Possibly, it is argued by Pollock that this is in continuation with the Shatavahana tradition, because they are coming up in the Deccan, and therefore it's possible that really they were continuing with a pattern that was set by the Shatavahanas. It is only later that the Pallavas began using Sanskrit in Pallava Grantha script. Actually, the expert on scripts is here before us, Dr. Vishnu Saxena, who has an entire thesis on Brahmi, but who also has great expertise on Grantha, Nagari, and so on. So you have really the Pallavas using Sanskrit, but developing the Grantha in their own style, and that's why we call it the Pallava Grantha script. And we have bilingual and biscriptal copper plates that begin to appear from the period after Mahendravarman I, that is after 630, Mahendravarman I from 600 to 630. Now, when we look at these bilingual and biscriptal, let's look at the copper plates of the Pallavas. We have 12 copper plates, 3 are in Sanskrit that belong to this period. 3 are in Sanskrit, 9 are bilingual. Yeah, bilingual here meaning Sanskrit and Tamil. One of these is in Sanskrit and Kannada. 2 of the Sanskrit portions, and this is very interesting, and Dr. Saxena would of course know of this. 2 of these have the Sanskrit portions written in Telugu Kannada script. Yeah, so there are all kinds of innovations, all kinds of strategies that are being used. The development of language, a literary culture, the development of script, all of these get entangled when you look at the way in which the copper plate is being produced itself during the Pallava times. Now, the Cholas adopt this bilingual, biscriptal tradition, which is already there, therefore. So, it's not something that is new that is coming up in the Chola copper plates, and we have essentially a Sanskrit portion and a Tamil portion that we find in the copper plates. Now, the Sanskrit portions generally begin with an invocation. Thereafter, there is a genealogy that is provided, and this genealogy is of 2 kinds. One is mythical and the other is historical. And of course, it will then come down to the current ruler in whose reign that particular inscription is being issued. And finally, it would end with a very brief description of the gift that is actually being made and the functionaries who are involved in requesting, that is the Vigyapti, and in the execution, that is the Agyapti of the grant. Now, the Tamil portions were generally more detailed descriptions of the gifts themselves, generally related to religious institutions, and the majority of these gifts to religious institutions were of the Brahmanical, Puranic, sectarian traditions, the cults of Vishnu and Shiva. So, it is Vaishnava and Shaiva religious institutions were the primary beneficiaries of these grants. Although, as was pointed out by Dr. Maksha Gandhi, and as many of us have argued in our works, the Buddhist, the Jaina traditions are very much visible. They are patronized by the rulers. You have, as was pointed out, a very important figure like the Chola Princess Kundavai, who is patronizing the Jain establishments and so on. So you have many such instances that royalty is very involved and invested in patronizing these various traditions, but there is no ambiguity about the fact that it is primarily the Puranic sectarian traditions that are the recipients of the grants. Now, what are the kinds of grants that we have? And this has been discussed in detail by Champak Lakshmi in this wonderful essay on ideology and the state, where she talks about the kinds of grants to the Brahmanas, the Brahmadeyas that we have, and then the grants to the temple as an institution. So both of these are religious grants. The Brahmanas as the repositories of Brahmanical knowledge, particularly of the religious kind, but also other kinds of knowledge. And the different kinds of knowledge that they possess are also often mentioned in these records. The Pallava records primarily talk about gifts to the Brahmanas. So that is what is very interesting over there, that you have more of references to the Brahmanas than to the temples per se. But in the Chola inscriptions, you do have a substantial number that are talking about gifts to the temples in the copper plates as well as the stone inscriptions. And it is primarily in terms of the arrangements that are being made that we can see the copper plates as presenting the details in the Tamil portion. The arrangements as far as the taking away of income is concerned, the granting of that income, and also the flows of revenue at different levels. And this is something that Professor Subbarayulu explained at great length yesterday in his talk. So what we have then is the copper plates, which have the Sanskrit portion. You have the Prashasti in the Sanskrit portion, which is where you find the royal eulogy, which is the issue of concern for me. The May Kirti is another such idea or concept that appears in the Chola period. And what is very important to note is that the May Kirti is a Chola innovation. It is something that actually appears first during the time of the Cholas and in the reign of Rajaraja Chola. It is in an inscription of the 8th regnal year that we find the May Kirti. What is the May Kirti? The May Kirti is essentially the description of the fame of the ruler. The Kirti, the fame of the ruler, and that is being talked of in terms of the wars and conquests that he undertakes. What is also important to know is that the May Kirti is updated to match the martial career of the king. So it's not as if once it is created, it is composed, there is no addition to it. In the case of Rajendra Chola in particular, it is estimated that there were at least 4 major editions or 4 different versions is how Nilakanta Shastri as well as Whitney Cox have talked about it. Although there is no substantive change in the early portions, it is in terms of what is added later. So now, what is this May Kirti? So when we are talking about the Prashasti, we see that it has a history already, that it appears in inscriptional texts from much before the time of the Cholas. The May Kirti, we are saying, appears really only from the time of the Cholas. But Emmanuel Francis, who has done a lot of work on inscriptions, has argued that this Mekirti was not a spontaneous development. It just doesn't come up during the time of the Cholas. The precursor to these for Francis was in the Sangam poems, eulogy of the rulers. The Puram poems, which are supposed to be about the kings and their military achievements and their munificence and so on, that there you have eulogies that the bards were singing. So the earliest or the kernel of the Mekirti, if we can call it that, is found in these Sangam poems, broadly dated between the 3rd century BC and 3rd century AD. And then he sees that it is primarily in the time of the Pallavas and that of the Rashtrakutas that the Mekirti as a form is gaining some kind of weight. Although the term Mekirti doesn't appear over there. So, what are the examples he gives? For instance, Nandivarman III Pallava, the Pallava ruler, ruling around 850 CE. So, this is the time when there is a tussle for power amongst various lineage groups, the two major ruling houses being the Pallavas and the Pandyas, and then you have the Cholas, the Muttarayars, the Gangas and others who are participating in the struggles, political struggles of these two major dynasties, and in the course of that they also are extending themselves beyond their territories. This is what B.D. Chattopadhyay is talking about, the political processes that are at work during the early medieval period. So, what we see is around circa 850, we have Nandivarman III, who in his inscriptions is referred to as Tellar Erinda, the one who burnt or conquered this particular area. And this idea, this Tellar, and this idea is then taken up, this achievement of his is then taken up in this poem that is in praise of Nandivarman III, the Nandi Kalambakam, where it is again then talked of, and then there is a long description of the wars and victories of Nandivarman III. So, it's in that sense that he says that there is actually a precursor to the Mekirti. Then he goes on to talk about the Rashtrakuta case of Krishna III, who is ruling around 939 to 967 CE. To further elaborate on this point. But I would like to, point out here that while there are such descriptions and eulogies of particular achievements, what is actually specific about the Chola Mekirti, what does stand out about the Chola Mekirti is that there is a systematization of the list of achievements, and this is something that is projected continually. This is not a random or sporadic self-image that is being publicly presented. So, in that sense, we may have descriptions, we may have eulogies that may be prior to that of the Cholas, the Mekirtis that are being created from the time of Rajaraja Chola, but I think it would be incorrect to see these as not Chola innovations and as actually therefore being based on the earlier tradition. There is something distinctive about what is happening at this point of time. The third major innovation, so when we actually look at one of the prashastis that we have of the Cholas, and any general work from Nilakanta Shastri downwards, you will find refers to this. You will find that the first line itself immediately will tell you that this is the Mekirti or the historical introduction of a particular ruler. So, this is of Rajaraja Chola, where he says, Tirumahala Pola Perunilai Selviyum Tanake Urumai Pundamai Manakkola Kandalur Shalai Kalamaruttaruliya Vengai Nadu Ganga Padiyum Tadihai Padiyum Nulamba Padiyum Kudamalai Nadum Kollamum Kalingamum, Muratel Singalar, Iramandalamum, etc., etc. So, there is this particular standard way now in which the achievements of the ruler are being presented, and this is also the case for the succeeding rulers thereafter. So for Rajendra Chola, you have Thirumannivalara Irunilai Madandayum, Porcheyapaavayum, Shirtani Shelviyum, Perundevi Rahi, and so on. And similarly for Kulotunga Chola, you have Puharshunda, Punariyahal, and so on. That is the, so when you look at this, you know that this is of that particular ruler. There are times it appears that there's some mixing of the introductions, but those are rare. I think there's just one instance that is pointed out by Nilakanta Shastri, but largely you have these set introductions with their introductory lines, which then, as I said, can be embellished further. So the Mai Kirti then is also something that is very, very important, and it appears as a public presentation of royal authority, of political power, and in that sense it is a very important part of the ideological transactions of the state that we can identify. Now when we come back, let's come back to the copper plates, and what we will find is that in the Sanskrit portions of the copper plates, we find that there is a mythological and symbolic universe, and this universe is provided by the epics and the Puranas primarily. Now Daud Ali, in his study of the royal eulogy, talks of it as world history. Okay, why is it world history? Because he says if we are looking from the inside, from the view from within the Puranas, then it is a world that they are creating, a world of Sanskritic ideas and culture, of Brahmanical gods and myths. And that is what is finding a place in the Prashasti. So this is an interesting point of view, and we'll come to this in a little bit. Now, George W. Spencer, looking at the genealogical descriptions which recanted the deeds of the king's ancestors, talks of these as having both a functional and fictive import. His title of his essay itself is very interesting: Heirs Apparent, Fiction and Function in Chola Mythical Genealogies. Now, the evocation of epic heroes, Puranic kings and the gods and their splendid deeds added an aura of legitimation to the ruler. So that's the reason why these are being used. Daud Ali argues that this aura was created, manifested and disseminated through a complex cultural discourse that found its expression in the literary idiom of the Kavya, and here he takes off from Sheldon Pollock. Now, this enterprise, as Ali says, required the presence and active engagement of a battery of specialists, the composers, the writers and the engravers. And we'll, again, this is a very important point and we need to take note of this. This also required then a familiarization. You know, when my student Sneha Ganguly first spoke about something, BTS Army, I didn't understand this at all because I don't live in that universe. I don't share that cultural universe. And it was only gradually that I began to understand what it means. Now, that is precisely what Daud Ali is talking about, that if you are not familiar with a particular cultural world, how will this make any sense? How does it make sense for a ruler to say that I am like Vishnu, or he is like Vishnu, or like Shiva, or like Indra, and so on? So you have to be familiarized with that particular cultural world, which allows for such a political expression. This was the institutionalization of a world history when looked at from within, according to Daud Ali. While largely in agreement with Spencer and Ali, I would like to juxtapose some of the information in different copperplate prashasti. Actually, it's not different. I'm going to focus only on one that complicates the idea of discursivity, especially proposed by Ali. So, what Daud Ali does is using structuralist and post-structuralist ideas, talks of the way in which we need to understand these in terms of the cultural nuances and play that is there, and therefore that there's a very elaborate kind of investment in a certain literary and cultural expression that is coming about. And this is a transactional kind of expression, in the sense that it is not a one-way presentation of ideas. It is also being modified, it is also being sharpened because of certain new ideas that are coming in, or new ways of expressing these. Now, if we were to look at the Velanjeri copper plates, which, as I mentioned, is considered one of the earliest, we have 5 plates only in the Velanjeri copper plate, each measuring about 22 by 6.5 centimeters. I think the thickness is of about 4 centimeters, and it is engraved on both sides. Now, the Sanskrit portion of this plate is shorter, having just 17 verses and some prose lines. Now, in the Tamil portion, having about 85 lines, details of the land grant are given. Let's look at the Sanskrit portion and think about what it is that is happening as far as presenting the ruler is concerned and the genealogy of the ruler is concerned. There is an invocation to Murari, the Rudras, and Cholendra. So this is something that is very, very interesting in the description that we have. So it says, for instance, let the lotus feet of Murari, which are pleasing by the radiance caused by the red water-bearing clouds, which are filled with garlands and caressed by the flowers on the head of it couldn't be red, so there's a blank there, which are ever rose in color by the lotus-like arm of Lakshmi, increase our prosperity and happiness. The second verse is, let the Rudras with their great bodies radiating like the golden colored clouds, bearing on their left halves pleasing and big female breasts, letting out from the roots of their braided hairs pure waves of clear water, wearing crescent-like ear ornaments, their necks shining with darkness, their bracelets shining with snakes, and their foreheads smiling with ashes, bestow prosperity on us. This is Rudras in the plural rather than in the singular that is mentioned here. And then the third verse says, let this dynasty of Cholendras, which planted its lotus feet on the crowns of all the kings, which proclaimed by their swords the expansion of the foreheads of sovereigns of the entire universe, encompassing the 7 seas, protect all the world. Right? We then have a description of various mythical figures. You have Brahma, who's described as lotus born, as emerging, this lotus itself emerging from the navel of Murari, and then Marichi, who is the mind born son of Brahma. And Marichi then begets Kashyapa, and from Kashyapa you have Surya, who is born, and then after many kings, so whenever there's a glossing over, when there's no direct relation that can be established, after many kings there was this great ruler called Ushinara, who is also known as Shivi. Now this is an allusion to the myth of Shivi as it appears in the Mahabharata. And also known in the Buddhist Jataka tradition. You have a Shivi Jataka. What is the story? In essence, the story is that to test the piety of the ruler and the kind of devotion he had towards his subjects in particular. You have Agni in the form of a dove who comes and takes refuge in the king and in King Shivi. And the dove is being pursued by Indra in the form of a hawk. And instead of giving up the dove to the hawk as is demanded by the hawk, the king offers his own flesh. And this is represented as a very great act, an act of, that is selfless, where the king is willing to give up his own flesh and maybe his life as well for his subject, for anyone who takes refuge under him. It's a very important motive, and it comes up in the in the Chola records repeatedly. It comes up, in fact, even in the Sangam poems. Of the late Sangam poems, you certainly have this motif that comes up even over there. So then after this, you have mention of a king who is Karikal Cholendra, who made the Himalayas the abode of Kubera, we are told, who built embankments on both sides of the river Kaveri, who built palaces in Kanchi, touching the skies. And in that same family, there was born Ko Chenkannan, who in a previous life was a spider that built a web around Shiva. Now, this is something again that is very, very interesting, because the story of Ko Chenkannan is briefly alluded to. Ko Chenkannan as a ruler is known in the later Sangam and in passing in all of the copper plates. He is referred to, but we also have him known in the Tamil Bhakti tradition as a great ruler. And his Bhakti is then elaborated in the 12th century hagiography of the Shaivites called the Periyapuranam. What is the story that we have? You have a Shivalinga under a Jambu tree. Jambu, of course, Jambu Dweepa. The association is very important. It's highly symbolic. So you have the Shivalinga under the Jambu tree, and an elephant would come every day and offer flowers and leaves as an abhisheka to the linga. But then a spider, who was also a devout Shaivite, a Shiva worshipper, would come and see these leaves after they have dried and flowers, and considered these to be unclean or polluting, and would take those off and would spin a web around, so that the flowers and leaves do not fall on the linga itself. And the next day, when the elephant would come, it would find this offensive, and so would take out the web. And then the spider would come, would again spin the web, and so on, and until finally both of them clash with each other, and the spider stings the elephant in its trunk, but the elephant then swipes the spider and both of them die. That's the story. And then we are told that at that point of time, the Chola king and queen, who were desirous of a child, come to Chidambaram, and then they are blessed with this spider, who is to be reborn as their child, as their son. And that is Ko Chenkannan. And again, there is this interesting thing about how in the Periyapuranam, how the wife, because they wanted him to be born at a particular time, we do this even today. Apparently, I have gynecologist friends who tell me that in this muhurta only we want our child to be born. So a caesarean operation has to be performed here. But what we have here is that the queen says, I want that child only at that auspicious moment. So she is tied in such a way, upside down, so this child doesn't come out before that particular time. And then the child comes out. And because he's been in the womb for so long, his eyes are red. So Chenkannan, that's why. So anyway, interesting stories that are then woven into the royal eulogy. Then we have the first historical ruler, what we talk of as the Vijayalaya line of the early medieval period, that is mentioned here, but not as Vijayalaya as he is mentioned in the later copper plates, but as Ottriyuran. That is from this place called Ottriyur. Tiruvottriyur is a very, very important Bhakti temple center. He is talked of as Ottriyuran, who is known for his valor. His son was Aditya, and then Parantaka was the son of Aditya. And then there is this long, and since this is an inscription that is issued by Parantaka, there's a long description of Parantaka about how he is like the moon that was born from the ocean, or the heat that emanates from the sun, or like the Trikuta peaks from Mount Meru, that celestial mount, the center of the universe. He is like Ganga, the celestial river that comes down and cleanses, that falls down from the Himalayas. and then various other things that are talked of as far as Parantaka is concerned. We are told that he performs the Tulabhara ritual. Now, there are some rituals, while the Pallava kings always talk about the Vedic sacrifices that they are performing. The Chola kings are also performing sacrifices. But it is especially certain kinds of rituals like the Tulabhara that appear in their records, and Tulabhara is where against the weight of the king, certain riches are being weighed and then they are distributed. And so you have three different places where this Tulabhara is happening. The place called Sri Ramatirtha, which is where the Vanaras had built a setu, so Rameshwaram, at Kanya Tirtha, which would be Kanyakumari, and at Sri Rangam, where Vishnu reclines. And then we have a mention of who the Vigyapti and the Agyapti are, and the kind of gift that is made, these three villages, and a huge amount of paddy that is given, and so on. Now, many of these allusions that we find in the Velangeri copper plate, which are mythical and historical, continue in the later Chola copper plate Prashastis. I had initially thought I will have a comparison, but realized that it won't be possible. I know I've overshot my time, so I'll just wind up. But what we do have is that similar kinds of things, and in fact an elaboration, especially in the mythical part. There's a huge elaboration that is there. In the historical part also, because you have now more definitive events that are being placed in the copper plates. You also have, very interestingly, in the later copper plates, some glossing over that is occurring. And that is especially where there is a difficulty in the succession, where it is not in this patrilineal tradition that is presented by the Cholas. You do not have the eldest son. Primogeniture is generally followed. You do not have the eldest son, but where another person is coming to the throne, who could be a younger son, who could be the brother, and so on. This has been discussed as the Pitra and the Bhratravya traditions that one can read into the kind of succession. This has been talked of by Whitney Cox, but essentially what we see is that this is something that more or less continues along the same pattern. Now, one thing that is very firmly established in all of the copper plates is that the Cholas were Suryavamshis. They belong to the solar lineage. But very interestingly, their individuality, their individual persona, was always characterized in comparison with both the sun and the moon. And there are certain ways in which the Somavamshi, Chandravamshi is also being brought into the ambit of the Cholas' assertion of power. The other thing that we find is that there are references to the Himalayas, the river Ganga, etc., which I've mentioned. In the Charala plates of Veera Rajendra, you have a very elaborate description of the coming of Ganga because of the austerities of Bhagiratha. A myth that is known in the Mahabharata and then in later texts. And in Rajendra's Ganga expedition, as well as in his Tiruvalangadu copper plates, the description of his bringing Ganga is compared also to Bhagiratha. So you have these kinds of allusions. So the Himalayas and Ganga appear to be two very important symbols, which are not merely geographical symbols. They are cultural symbols that are being invoked by these Chola rulers. And so it is postulated that Rajendra the First's Ganga expedition was both a royal proclamation of Digvijaya as well as a symbolic conquest or claim over a cultural signifier. So it's in that sense that we can read this whole expedition and so on. And I have written about it, especially in the way in which in iconographic plans of the Chola period you have, and this is something that begins in the Pallava period, you have Shiva as Gangadhara, one who holds Ganga on his head. That becomes very an important icon. But certainly this is something that really stands out when we look at the eulogies. And while we are talking about the Himalayas and Ganga, it is also important to know that these are not just Brahmanical cultural signifiers. They are as much cultural signifiers in the Buddhist and the Jain traditions, right? And in that sense, to see, to broaden the way in which we look at the idea of the cultural signifier from what Dawood Ali is talking of. Now, further, when we look at the historical rulers, they're repeatedly compared to gods, mythic heroes, and often shown as surpassing the feats of these. For instance, in the Tiruvalangadu copper plate, Arumozhivarman is described as Murari with goddess Lakshmi clinging to him and having the Shankha and Chakra marks on his palms. In verse 80 of this plate, we are told that Raghava had to build a setu with the help of the Vanaras. With the monkey army, he built this bridge to cross over to Lanka. And then he crosses over, but he has great difficulty in defeating and killing the Lord of Lanka. In contrast, we are told the general of Arumozhivarman crosses the ocean easily by ship and then burns the ruler of Lanka, thus surpassing Rama. So these are the very interesting ways in which they use the mythic allusions, but there's also this one-upmanship that you can read into the descriptions. Now, there are other ways in which in inscriptions, the use of certain kind of terminology, for instance, by referring to the kings as precious jewels, Shikhamani, Chudamani, Chintamani, and so on that you find, the reference to them as being invaluable, their personal charisma, like being Shitala, like the Shashi, Kirana, and so on, like the moonbeams being so cool, and their appearance resembling that of the gods. Kama especially is invoked. Their persona and actions, especially the dana that they perform, the rituals that are associated with them, and very often, especially in the terminology to do with their everyday rituals, their place of residence, and so on, there is a clear parallel with that of the gods, and this has been discussed by Veluthat, Keshavan Veluthat, and Champak Lakshmi in their writings. Right? Now, lastly, when we look at the ideological transactions, what we also find is the cultivation of an aesthetic. As we've already said, the Kavya provides that possibility of the cultivation of an aesthetic with alankara or embellishment in forms, in motifs, the upama and various other such things that are being used. But the king as an aesthete himself, we also see in the first millennium, he is known in the literature of the times. So the hegemony of the aesthetic values and cultural symbols depended on the patronage of accomplished scholars and ideologues, which Dawood Ali had talked about, who through their compositions and interpretations, both religious and non-religious, created a space for Sanskrit ideas within the Tamil landscape. But others have argued that what we also see is the recasting of Tamil expressions of power in the Sanskritic mold that we find. One of the best examples is the patronage of poets like Narayana Kavi by Rajendra Chola, who is described as the son of Shankara, as the resident of Parshvagrama. He is the composer of the eulogies of Rajendra Chola. In the court of Kulotunga Chola, you have Jayamgondar, who is the author of Kalingathu Parani, which is a huge eulogy in praise of Kulotunga Chola. It talks about the campaign of Kulotunga to Kalinga, against Kalinga, and in the course of it there are various descriptions of the king, the genealogy of the king, etc., that is provided. So very clearly, and then we have the Muvarula and various other such texts also that convey these kinds of ideas. So there is a very very Tamilized expression also that we find that use the Sanskritic ideas and models, and some of those Tamil ideas that are also going into the Sanskritic representations. Now, I return then to a point that I had flagged right at the beginning, the idea of ritual sovereignty posited by Bertenstein, reframed by James Heitzman as ritual authority, and in its most recent avatar, finds its way in Dawood Ali's work, expressed as theistic polity. I do not agree with this framing, primarily because of the way in which, especially in the work of Bertenstein and to some extent in the work of Dawood Ali, the ideological is privileged. It appears overprivileged, and the political seems to be subordinated. The Prashasti, when we do look at the royal eulogies, especially when we study the Shasanas, Tamra Shasanas, these were essentially charters of material transactions. They are voiced in such a way as to express the king's image in a certain fixed manner, in a certain stylized manner. But one cannot be read in isolation from the other. You cannot separate the so-called ideological elements from the material elements. Rather than view these ideological transactions as separate or above the material and the mundane, I would like to bring in Champak Lakshmi's important analysis of these records as devices that were meant certainly for legitimation, where they evoke a regional and trans-regional cultural universe, but the representation is also one that is done precisely to enable the kind of structural and institutional changes and transformations that are being wrought by the Chola state. Thank you.
So their loyalty or allegiances to their village, to their caste, community, language is so deep that it is not possible for them to imagine an institution, a supreme political institution, which we are calling state. So this is the theory, and I'm very glad that you went into the material which can be used to understand or critique this particular um, viewpoint. And that is why, frankly, whenever we use the word state formation, I become very, very jittery. Uh, स्टेट तो फॉर्म हुए जा रही है पता नहीं कब से so this is there also there is a hint that look you are still not there. So it's very important. Another interesting point that I found very pertinent for a wider discussion is the mixing of religion and politics. The state, by definition, is a political institution. But the manner in which it articulates its existence and it communicates with a wider audience uh, is also important. And there is a variety of ways in which, and this is one very important way. Although the paradox is that the uh, if there is a prashasti which is very dense, very poetic, full of alankaras, how far it can go, how much you can communicate with people. Are you communicating with yourself or a small circle of nobles and officers and intellectuals or uh, literateurs, or you want to reach a wider audience? So that's another very interesting point, the point of communication. Because power, unless it is articulated and unless it is used to influence other people, is very difficult to operate in this particular sphere. So, frankly, I'm very glad that I myself have lots of interesting leads to use epigraphic material to raise these questions, the question of how the state articulates its existence, consolidates power, which sometimes we call legitimacy, and how does communication take place, and Thank you very much for actually showing the meaty part of that communication. I'm afraid there is no time for discussion, I'm told. So we once again we are grateful to Professor Mahalakshmi for a very absorbing presentation.